The next presentation is going to be by Mike Austin, University of California, Berkeley, on social administration and management. And then the discussant is Jennifer Mosley, my colleague in the School of Social Service Administration. After that, we're going to have about a 15-minute break, but there's a lot of us. There's coffee in the corner. If you want to get up and have coffee, feel free. I do want to remind everybody something I failed to do at the beginning. These signs that are all over the place, just reminding you, we are recording this. We're archiving this. It'll be on our website, perhaps other websites. And we are going to be, these folks get a chance to revise these papers, and they'll go through peer review, and it's going to be published in a special issue, Social Service Review, this December. So you'll have lots of time to rethink this. So we have it working.
I want to thank Mark for the opportunity to share some ideas in his rapid 20-minute time slot, but to also reflect a little bit about this notion of 100 years and the mind-boggling challenge that represents. For me, it's also influenced by the fact that as a social work practitioner, I've lived 50 of those 100 years. As a macro practice social worker, of course, I got my MSW when I was 9 years old, so you can do the math. But I think part of the challenge for me, and I think with hats off, by the way, to Rick Barth in our audience for helping to push us in the direction of these grand challenges. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the fact that grand challenges also need grand strategies. And this is the entry point for me for macro practice and how we think about macro practice. So I'll come back to that as well. Clearly, as I look back in our literature, which is absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to bore you with some of it, I'm struck by what has changed and what has not changed. And some of the literature that I'm reading has to do with things like in 1950, a colleague in the social work management field out of Minnesota came quoted in one of his articles and saying, he called it casework and administration. I call it micro and macro. Cannot be separated from each other without changing the character of each. Try that again. That the micro and macro distinctions in our field that are currently today, and this was a 1950 paper, cannot be separated from each other without changing the character of each. And so part of what I'll be talking about, because we have a whole direct practice discussion coming, but to talk more about macro practice and particularly around the management issues. It wasn't until the mid-70s, well, actually it was in the mid-50s, that the first course in administration was taught in schools of social work as a single course for everybody. That is now gone in many schools. It doesn't even exist. So one of the interesting things was, well, what happened after that? One of the things that happened was this evolution of thinking around, well, shouldn't we have specializations that allow students to major in this macro practice arena, management, community practice, and so on? I graduated from UC Berkeley with my MSW in what was called community organizing and administration. This was one of the first programs in the country, along with Columbia and Ohio State and others. They were offering actually specialized programs for MSW students. So one of the things that I've been intrigued with is how come this management, or even macro practice broadly, continues to be ancillary to direct practice interests of students. Because in our school, it's 85% direct practice, 15% macro practice. And I describe myself as a social worker who happens to work on campus, which is a little bit different from my colleagues, because in the context of working on campus, I'm a social work educator and I'm a social work researcher. That's defined by the institution I work for. So let me sort of share with you the perspective that I bring to this, because I think it may be helpful in the context of describing the future of management practice. So you'll see several sort of items for me that I find important. Seeking a big picture perspective that represents the view from the top of only one mountain, the mountain I sit on. And so that means you're only hearing one person's perspective. I'm hoping I'm representing others, but maybe not. Two, that context is everything. Obviously, we've talked already about the impact of the presidential election and redefining citizenship from passive, I go and vote, and some people don't even do that, to active, which is more than voting. What else do we do when it comes to thinking about the future of our country and obviously social work practice? I come from a perspective that focuses on the centrality of practice, which means, from my definition, that what we are doing in our social work programs has to do with theory-informed practice, policy-informed practice, evidence-informed practice, values-informed practice, but the focus is always on why are these students here and why are we there as educators teaching them. For me, it's a practice focus, and I'm not always sure, even in my own colleagues, whether people really buy into that notion. Management, obviously, from my perspective, is a form of social work practice, but only a part of macro practice, because the community practice and policy practice are equally important components of what we mean by macro practice. So that's sort of one aspect of perspective for me. A second aspect has to do with the fact that not only are we practice focused, but the core value of our profession is social justice, among many, but that's one of the premier values. And the question is, how does that get played out in multiple ways? I'm assuming I won't spend a lot of time on these because, is Michael here? I didn't see him in the audience. Is he going to be is he a discussant on today? Yeah. Anyway, there he is. Okay. This is your thunder, so I'm not going to steal it, other than to indicate that this is a piece of why we think about the role of managers playing in the social justice agenda of our field, and it includes everything from maintaining the big picture to understanding both the ethical imperatives of social justice into practice, engaging in risky activism, and obviously the notion that the survival of macro practice is in the collective self-interest of the entire profession. And so we aren't just the other stepchildren in the room, we are also players in the social work practice arena. We can probably get into a huge discussion on that. So themes from the past 100 years, and this is quick, it'll be much more in the paper. But I like to think of Jane Addams as a manager. She's known for other things, but I like to think of Harry Hopkins as a manager, obviously in public policy arena. And I like to think of somebody whom you may not have heard of called Fred Ross, who was what we would call today the campaign manager in California for farm workers. He was the behind-the-scenes person managing the entire process, including knocking on the door of Cesar Chavez as a young a father of, I think, one at that time in San Jose, saying, do you know what's happening to the Latino workers in this state of ours, and you need to get involved. And I want to show you, and of course, Fred Ross was trained out of the Chicago model of the Industrial Areas Foundation and the whole early Alinsky thinking about how does this play itself out. To me, he's one of our early campaign managers in the context of how we think about management. Now, another thing I noticed as I was looking through the history, and this is only a beginning piece, as Mark says, we're writing these papers, trying to figure out how to cram 100 years into one paper. But one of the things I've noticed is in our field, in social work, the production or the codification of practice knowledge turns out to be, in many places, but the most dominant place, it appears, is in our textbooks. And if you looked at the late 70s to the early 2000s, roughly that 25, 30-year period, and I haven't stopped counting yet, but I'm over the number 15 right now of a flourish of textbooks on social work management in our field. And that's a part of our history, and the meaning of that obviously needs to be both explored and thought about more. It was in the late 70s as well that we launched our first journal, then called Administration and Social Work, today called Human Service Organizations. So Mark wanted us to focus in this presentation less on history and more on, so what's the present and where are we going, which is part of what I'm trying to do in this piece. And these are things that I think many of you in the audience already know. The proliferation of undergraduate degrees in nonprofit management. We are very marketplace sensitive in macro practice. We're looking at who else is doing the stuff that's like ours, whether it's in urban and regional planning for our community organizer types, or in other grassroots non-university-based training programs, extensive. Same and true in the area of public administration, that was mentioned earlier, and in public policy. At the same time, we have this huge expansion of generalist and advanced social work practice going on, where supposedly macro practice is mentioned. In some programs, it's a week. In some programs, it may be 3 weeks. But the notion that somehow this got mixed into both generalist practice and advanced practice means we lost ground. The question is how much and to what effect. We are also operating, obviously, in the scarcity of resources because the growth of macro practice has taken place in our big schools, whether it's Michigan or Maryland or Hunter. These have been places where the resources are there, and by definition, the stated value of this form of practice is being clearly enunciated. Not so in the vast majority of other schools, where they're also wiping out the macro practice program because there are university budget cuts, our major student demand is direct practice, we don't need this, we need to get rid of this. So this is happening in lots of places. It's not well known because these are embarrassing developments for most schools of social work as well as universities more broadly. This is also taking place in the midst of the third wave of our legislative arena, just to mention a few, having to do with the ADA in the early 90s, the child health piece, obviously some of the classic examples of welfare reform. I've been studying for the last number of years the implementation of that policy and the community level, what has that meant, but also the implementation of the ACA and whatever the White House is trying to do with it now. This comes at the very same time where Jack Rothman helped us pioneer at the University of Michigan and UCLA in helping us sort of hold up a mirror to ourselves and say, hey folks, you've got to wake up to what is happening in our field with regard to macro practice broadly. And did that, obviously, as part of a report that was initially managed, obviously, out of ACOSA, but also with then a commission set up to follow up on that whole activity. And that was obviously can be described and has been described elsewhere. So the question then becomes, what's the central role of social work profession in management practice? This is what is direct practice helping us in thinking about? And clearly, it includes a number of things, and I'll just briefly mention them, but they're all familiar to you. The history of the commitment to serving vulnerable populations and core values of social justice, the value-based and strength-based notions of our field, the centrality of relationships, and conscious use of self in implementing practice principles. This is core to anybody who's an effective manager, let alone a community organizer. The centrality of group work. I'm always struck by what happened internationally to our field when we exported casework principles to developing countries and not group work principles. And yet that was where collective societies could have benefited so much more from our development than necessarily handling a case and a case record, in a developing country situation. Advocacy-based as amplifying the voices of service users and agency staff, in some cases unionization, clearly on the agency staff side, but also the notion, and I've been looking at some of the work in the Nordic countries around how do we amplify the voices of service users as a management responsibility, not just a community responsibility. And obviously the work ethic that's associated in good social work practice with documenting service delivery. And some of my research more recently is in child welfare, looking at case records, qualitative data, case records of child welfare social work practitioners. So the uneven role of the profession in promoting management is I think, somewhat well known. We're obviously operating in a highly competitive labor market. There's been limited national support for macro practice, although I think that's changing, as both CSWE has been responding a bit to the macro practice matters issues. We now have a section, I think, in NASW that's not too many years old around administration. We've got a network out there called the Network on Social Work Management. And obviously, we have a special interest group here at SWR on organization and management. But I think the primary dilemma for us is shelf space. In a social work curriculum, it is so competitive to who gets shelf space. And for the macro practice folks, it's quite limited. And part of it is linked to the fact that student demand is primarily clinical or direct service, and faculty are appropriately responding to that. And yet it's not always clear to me when I talk to my direct service colleagues that they have any real understanding of what the knowledge and skill base is to function in management as a social worker. So the uneven role also includes student attitudes, and we've had a number of interesting examples where when in the first semester of our MSW program and the faculty member says, well, what are the concentrations represented in this room? Mental health, child welfare, and so on. And then the management and planning students say, well, I'm interested in management and planning. And there's a hissing sound in the room, not checked by the faculty member. And the question is, what's that about? And I've been intrigued with this over the years, where this sort of, what in fact is happening in some cases is that our incoming students are carrying with them the attitudes and experience that they've had in the agency. And part of those attitudes have to do with management doesn't know what the hell it's doing, and management's attitude, line staff isn't in completing their case records in a timely way, et cetera. So this notion of the internal tension that's going on in our agencies, okay, is brought back onto campus, and we see it in our classrooms as well. Anyway, so the notion here is that there's sort of a call for paying attention to this whole area. I'm going to skip these principles. They're going to be elaborated more in the paper itself, and to focus more on the themes that I see emerging out of this whole arena that are worth paying attention to, in my mind. Anyway, in the area of innovation, I work, by the way, in a collaborative that's now 30 years old that's made up of 12 Bay Area County social service directors. These are county directors. Meet with them 5 times a year. These are all people in the policy implementation business and trying to figure out how to change policy, but also how to handle the impact of public policy on their work. And one of the things they've been wrestling with is this concept of instead of doing more with less, doing more differently, fundamentally differently. And I'm happy to elaborate on that too. That there's craftsmanship needed to design and implement new service strategies in the context of innovation, and that one of the challenges that many of our agencies are facing is how do we develop learning organizations in order to engage in knowledge-sharing activities that supports workers who are interested in evidence-informed practice. The mechanisms, the structures aren't there to help staff actually utilize some of the research that we've all been talking about. Second is that a major theme also is around data-informed decision-making, managing the increased amounts of data and defining and measuring outcomes, a huge issue for us in our field, balancing the quantitative admin data with the qualitative case record data, service quality and accountability, the collaborative service user-centered and culturally informed service programming requires us to be paying more attention to the quality and accountability of the services we're now currently delivering. And then the last set of themes have to do with leading, I think, organizational reform, making the transition from individual program outcomes to social impact. Lots of current discussion around how do you define and measure social impact. Continuing to promote cultural and gender-responsive human service organizations, managing the continuing flow of legislative changes, increasing reliance on cross-sector contractual relations. Part of our research is looking at what is this contracting relationship between county government social services and the nonprofit providers that they rely so heavily on. Rebuilding bridges between micro and macro practice. This is huge. This is just huge because we are in this boat together and we keep forgetting that for some reason. And yet they're not the mechanisms clearly for crossing those bridges. And then more cross-sector coordination, collaboration is a huge issue among public, nonprofit, and nonprofit agencies. So, what does this mean for the future of social work education? It means confronting the past, in my mind. 80 to 90% of the managers are coming from the clinical ranks. We are not producing enough social workers to meet the needs in the field. And so the question is, how do we build upon that as opposed to how do we ignore that? Huge issue, I think, in terms of training modules. Rethinking the MSW program. There are many students now coming in with, can I get an MSW and an MPP in public policy or other dual degree programs? And how do we respond to this in a more unified way over time? Including the bridges now to our new clinical or direct service, whatever you want to call that, DSW programs. And where is macro practice in that discussion? Because all I hear is clinical and getting people ready for private practice of some form. call for obviously massive, I use massive advisedly here, social work in-service training programs, because we also need to confront the fact that 80 or more % of the people delivering social service in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector have no social work background. None. And so we're now in the midst of sort of putting together training materials, and I'm working with a New York animated videographer to figure out how do you tell the story of social welfare legislation from 1935 to 2010 in 7 minutes. 7 minutes to be infused into the training program of all staff, clerical on up, in our public agencies. So anyway, the notion here of this is what I mean by massive. And then for the future of social work practice, increased use of obviously data analytics, because we're generating so much data to inform organizational decision making, the need for an Office of Innovation in Human Service Organizations, I can talk more about that, and then the volunteer governance question around, we've got people sitting on our nonprofit boards who don't really understand social services, don't understand social work, don't understand the history of the agency they're serving on the board, and therefore is a huge challenge for us to educate. And then finally, future for social work research. We are all struggling with the research to practice gap, linking on the one hand interdisciplinary research to interdisciplinary practice. We don't talk much about that linkage. What is that? How does that work? How could that work? Secondly, expanding the role of practice research. This is an area that I've been devoting a lot of time to, which is how do we define a research-minded practitioner, and how do we help them in their own practice? What does that mean? And then finally, obviously, and this is my own bias, building more university agency foundation research consortium. This has been the basis of my work over the last number of years in this BASC, is the Bay Area Social Services Consortium, that some of this is a reflection of. And that's it. Did I make it?
Hi. So let me start by just saying that it's really a privilege to be part of this group and to be asked to comment on Mike's excellent presentation. To me, I think that the central challenge Mike presents to us is the material that he addressed in the beginning of his talk, which I think maybe can be stated even more plainly. Specifically, I would ask, does management even have a future in the social work profession? As it currently stands, I don't think that the future looks that bright. As the latter part of his talk shows, we actually know quite a bit about the challenges of management in the 21st century and how to address those challenges. But I think that without a renewed commitment by the profession to teaching, mentoring, and research in this area, I think that social work is running the risk of becoming irrelevant in conversations about how to best lead human service organizations, which are obviously the very same organizations in which most social workers carry out their practice. So I want to make clear first why I think that we should care if social work has a voice in management. So early in the presentation, he made 2 points that I think bear repeating. First, he noted that macro practice leadership, and management practice specifically, is where we translate the ethical imperative of social justice into action. So he wrote that the survival of macro practice is in the collective self-interest of the social work profession, because it's at that level that we organize and advocate for social work values. In other words, we need social workers to also be managers if we're to see our collective values expressed in the agencies that we practice in. I would push this one further, even though, as I alluded to just before, if we abdicate our historic professional identity of contributing to management as well as direct services, we're giving up the opportunity to control many of the conditions that influence the quality of our work. Increasingly, it's folks with MBAs that nonprofit boards want to hire into executive director and top management positions. And yes, MBAs often have lots of great skills in lots of areas, but folks with MBAs are not trained to think about what social workers do on any level other than the quantitative output and outcome measurement. Those things are important, but they're not the only things that are important. Our clients are individuals, not widgets. And as Zeke Hasenfeld drilled into my brain in graduate school, people are raw material, right? And people are really complicated. That's a central insight into the work of human service organizations, and the reason why sometimes, even when we provide perfect services, we don't have perfect outcomes. The difficulty of the work that we do and the inconsistency in outcomes leads to the cyclical accountability and legitimacy crises that are experienced in the human services. Furthermore, it's those legitimacy crises that make human service organizations prime targets for people who would wish to call into question the value of relational work in an outcomes-oriented world, or challenge the notion that marginalized populations can and do make meaningful contributions to society. So all this is to say that I would much rather have someone who has comprehensive training regarding the nature of the work that social workers actually do be in charge of explaining it to others, of raising money for others, and entering into agreements about how it's carried out. So Mike lays this out really well in his talk, I think. Commitment to shared leadership, inclusion of marginalized voices, strengths-based and client-centered approaches to practice, recognition of the importance of advocacy. These are all hallmarks of a social work perspective, and I would argue that they make social work uniquely well qualified to study and lead mission-based organizations. These are the values that we bring to management, and they're what make us good at management. Increasingly, good management is getting defined as being able to maximize something called impact. And impact is important, but calls for impact are often tied to larger cultural tropes about the wastefulness in the human services and result in policies that emphasize economic value over moral value. And I don't think that anyone is better situated than social workers to thread the needle in pursuit of both of those things. So does management have a future in social work? Mike had up on his slide something about a 20% by 2020 campaign, right? Is that even possible? And I agree with him that, if pressed, I would have to admit that in most schools of social work, I don't think that it's currently possible for an MSW student to get a solid background in management. And I think that students know that, and so those that have a specific interest in administrative practice are looking elsewhere. We can't get to 20% if we don't have robust programs for folks to enroll in. Complicating matters, again, as Mike points out, there's been that explosive growth in nonprofit management programs and an increased focus in nonprofit management and public administration programs. Those folks are getting specific training in leading mission-focused organizations, and they're much harder to pick on than corporate types that think that they can solve all our problems by just being business-minded. So should we encourage students who know that they're interested in organizational leadership to just attend those programs? Or will we build the space for them in social work? Right now, in many schools, by not having a robust management curriculum, we're effectively communicating that either management is so easy or unimportant that we assume people can learn on the job just by doing it, or that we don't care if people with a social work background ever end up in those positions. And I think that needs to change. So what should we do? First, in order to rebuild our position in the larger field, I think that we have to participate more in interdisciplinary conversations, meetings, and knowledge development. There's a lot of work being done in this area by an interdisciplinary community of scholars, but there are few leaders from social work. Admittedly, I've talked a lot about curricular and practice issues just now, but I hope you see why. If we aren't teaching management in organizations, we aren't hiring and building institutional support for organizational scholarship. And there's been a real decline in the numbers of social workers involved in organizational scholarship and the impact of their work as a result. So I think that we need to re-envision and re-articulate much more clearly what the value added is of thinking about management from a social work perspective. And I think that that can help clarify what we uniquely have to offer to that larger interdisciplinary conversation. But perhaps more importantly, it might help remind ourselves about what we have to contribute. So beyond simply applying our values and perspective, what should a social work-centered management curriculum look like? What should we be teaching so that our students are prepared to lead? And what do we need to focus on in our research so that we're building the knowledge base that can help push the field forward in new ways? Mike lays out some of this at the end of his talk, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of his ideas. So first, in regards to curriculum design, I appreciate that he encourages us to think outside the box about what the MSW should look like. A real struggle is simply the limited amount of time that we have with students and the limited degrees of freedom that they have in their schedules. So perhaps an additional semester that would be in a management intensive would work for some students that have interests in both micro and macro practice. Second, in regards to teaching, I think improved data analytics and evaluation training is crucial if our students are to be more competitive when they graduate. It's imperative now for directors at all levels to be able to manage and make sense of lots of data, to know what's useful and what to act upon, and how to assess and communicate program outcomes, both quantitatively and qualitatively. That would also benefit our policy students, and that can't be learned adequately on the job. Third, one area that I might challenge Mike to think more about in the next iteration of his paper is what the scholarly contributions of social workers to this field have been and what questions we need to be working on more as we move forward. So, for example, one thing that social workers are really good at doing is thinking across levels, right? So, for example, the relationship between micro and macro, or the interface between organizational and policy practice. So that's a place where we could make a real contribution to the literature in terms of thinking about how those different planes interact. I also didn't hear that much in his talk about collaboration and working in teams. I think advancing knowledge in that area is really important in the face of demands to participate in collective impact initiatives, collaborative governance processes. But it's also a recognition that that old notion of a single, siloed, hierarchical organization doesn't work very well in today's society. Our professional knowledge about systems and power, I think, gives us a competitive advantage in that area. And then the last thing that I want to urge Mike to address in the final version of his paper is diversity and inclusion in human service organizations. So this is an area in which social work is well positioned to lead, but in order to do that, we need to reckon with our own past and come to terms with our own history of marginalizing and siloing women and people of color. This is a problem that's particularly endemic to administration and management, which I think especially in the most professionalized social service agencies remains unrepresentative of the field in terms of the proportion of white men. So my hope for the future is that social work can live its values by encouraging, supporting, and training more women and people of color to take those top leadership roles. And then I'll just conclude by saying that I think that the current generation is really ready for these changes. They're entrepreneurial, they're innovative, they've been raised to be leaders and creative thinkers. If your schools are anything like mine, they're also an activist generation that want to see changes in the status quo. And I think that's exactly who we need leading the way in social work organizations. But we're letting them down by not providing the training and the tools for them to pursue the path of organizational leadership. So we have done better in the past. I think we can do better, and I'm going to just throw my hat in with Mike in saying that I think that administrative practice is an important part of the legacy of social work, and it worries me deeply to see us just let it go. That's it.
Thanks much. Much to think about. We've got about 10 minutes before our coffee break, so questions, comments, thoughts?
Hi, my name is Tina Shirelli-Helminiak from Westchester University of Pennsylvania, and I was glad to hear you recognize, Dr. Austin, the Network for Social Work Management. They recognized my dissertation in 2014 for looking at the organizational factors related to burnout and job satisfaction. And one of the things that I think that we're missing in the current self-care movement is what our organizations do to our workers and how we're not addressing the fact that we are overwhelming them and they are increasingly leaving the field. And by them leaving the field, then we lose the next generation of leaders because they're not doing the work, they're not getting trained to take on leadership positions, and then the gap is being filled by the MPAs and the MBAs. And so I think we need to stop looking at self-care from an individual movement. It's not about how much yoga we do or how much counseling we get for ourselves. It's about the organizational practices that are burning out our workers and our students and our future leaders. So just my comment, thank you.
Do you want to take several? Okay. Couldn't agree more. I think part of the challenges, and I'm delighted that you mentioned your dissertation as well, is this question of what constitutes organizational leadership that's internally focused and what constitutes organizational leadership that's externally focused. And these are both areas that I think are in desperate need of new thinking, the kind you're suggesting. What is the workplace we're generating by the way in which work is allocated over time? Let alone how are we connecting outside of our agency with others who might also help in the rethinking of the nature of the work being done. So I think your point's well taken, and it's a huge, huge challenge that you're posing.
If there's not, I'm going to make a comment that I was going to make the last talk that I actually think is relevant to this as well. I mean, categorizing social work into silos is hard, right? And so the comment, so a lot of Mike's talk was about macro practice, not about management practice being a part of macro practice. And that's why I think what I'm about to say, although I was thinking about it in the policy domain, also fits in this article as well, or this talk as well. And that is that I think that a huge contribution of social work, I was going to say social work to social policy, but we can say social work to macro practice, is what I would see as our competitive advantage in going inside the black box of organizations that carry out policy, and also to really dig into the lived experience of people who are affected by our policies. And thirdly, I think a huge contribution of social work to social policy and to macro practice is our intense focus on distributional effects in a way that other disciplines don't do it. So we think very intentionally, many of us do, most of us do, I think, about the effects of policies, the effects of organizational practices on oppressed groups, on marginalized groups, and we often center those groups in our analysis. So I think actually it sounds like Mike and Jennifer's work for this journal is talking about those things, and I was glad to see it in the management practice chapter, and I kind of hope it's also in the policy chapter, because I think it's a huge part of the contribution of social work to social policy. I think we do a lot of work, really good work on policy analysis, and all the work that was mentioned is really important. But in addition, I think, as I said, our competitive advantage is actually also on the implementation side and the lived experience side and the distributional effects side. So I think that has to be in the journal somewhere. I feel like that's really where we've done a lot of our work.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you're reinforcing some of the questions that relate to people who manage and also people who are dealing with public policy, both from an implementation side, but also from a redesign and advocacy side. And I just think, I'm just intrigued with this notion that over the years, we have educated students about social welfare policy, things you ought to know. Not so much things about what you ought to do with what you know about the Social Security Act or recent ACA legislation, whatever it might be. So this is why I keep coming back to the fact that it's our faculty responsibility, although my colleagues don't always share this, to be envisioning themselves as educators with regard to policy-informed practice. How do practitioners think about what they're doing in the light of the public policies that influence the services they deliver? And I think what we've done over the past is help people see all these policies that evolved over time, their strengths and their limitations, but not in the context of daily practice. And so I think this is another area that you're flagging, and I think Jennifer did too. I don't know if you want to comment. But.
No, I
okay.
agree. Yeah.
I'm sorry to be so chatty today, but it's very exciting. I teach social welfare history and policy, so I'm really excited about it. Anyway, there's a little tendency here to bifurcate with the management in the business schools and, this sort of thing. I just want to say that at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, we have a very big MSW program. We have a Master of Science in Social Policy program, and we have a nonprofit leadership program. And what we're working towards now mostly is interarticulating all three of those programs into major courses that they all can take and learn from each other. So there is that route as well, which I think you would approve of.
It's really exciting.
It's exciting from another perspective that you may not know. But when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in 1985, there was no macro practice opportunities for students, zero. And it was sort of like, do we need that? And I said, yes, it's part of social work practice. So I'm delighted to see that this has evolved considerably from.
Very strong, too. The macro social work part of things is also very strong, too.
Great. That's great.
Okay, sorry.
Laura Abrams from UCLA. So I'm in a School of Public Affairs, and I'm the director of social welfare, and alongside public policy and urban planning. And even though there's competition around this domain from all three departments, who's going to be in charge of human services, we are collaborating to form an undergraduate major. So I think, just as Bobby said, like the collaboration is possible, but if we try to just stake our claim without that collaboration, I think we'll lose something. One other point I just wanted to make in regard to Jennifer's comment was about hiring faculty who are invested in organizations and management. And I think with the recent push to hire folks who are NIH fundable, this is for faculty, everyone in the room, but I think we need to really think about if that's what we're valuing is, are we really gonna hire students who wanna be students of management, administration, and so forth, which is not as much in the NIH domain. So I don't know if we have time, but I'd love to hear a quick response to that, because that concerns me around who we hire at schools that are trying to promote faculty in all these areas.
I mean, I would agree. I think all those things are interrelated, right? I mean, we see in growth in some parts of the curriculum and a contraction in other parts, and they go right along with sort of the success and grantsmanship and how much external funding you're bringing in. And I think that those pressures on schools are very real, right? So I don't, I recognize the bind that folks are in, but I do think that we have to think about the big picture and what we're losing if we're letting essentially someone else's research agenda dictate what it is that social work should be focusing on broadly. So,
Okay, we had one last, hopefully, quick comment or question.
I'm Jeff Charline from University of Pennsylvania. I'm just thinking about your comments about the shift in where curricula are, from macro to more micro. I was just interested in kind of throwing out there also the labor market part of the piece of the puzzle, and when job postings are for social workers, like what they're looking for and how, and those obviously interrelate with each other, who's being trained for what and who's being looked for what, but how, yeah, then that's basically the question. Is that clear, or should I?
I'm not sure I get it.
So I'm thinking that the labor market for social workers is predominantly for micro-practice clinical, when people want managers, as let's say there's a trend more to looking for the MBAs, the outcome-oriented. So I'm just wondering how you see those two interrelate, the labor market demand and then on the training side for social workers.
Well, it's interesting. Our program is small, so we have 15 to 18 graduates a year coming out of our program, and they get absorbed in a large, service economy surrounding both the Bay Area, but California. We're talking about 36 million in this state. So we are a drop in the bucket. But I think your question in part relates to how do people enter the field in ways, and we've had students, focused in several different directions. There's usually about, I'd say, 25% of our graduates who came into the program saying, I've been in direct service, I don't want to do that anymore. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And they said, well, I want to do systems change. I said, okay, you're in the right place. That same 25% when they graduate say, I kind of miss working with the kids, and I kind of miss working with the seniors. I think I'm going to go back into practice in direct practice position, because I know it won't be long before they're going to ask me to supervise staff and run a program and become whatever. So there's sort of that model, and then others who are really committed to being program managers. They look for those positions. They don't call them social work positions. They're called something else. Same with our community practice folks. The label is outreach worker, but it happens to be the community organizer for the neighborhood health center. So I think the dilemma is recognizing how these jobs are described in the labor market, because they do not begin with social work. And our students need help sometimes realizing that's how they need to look. I mean, I also involve students a lot in informational interviewing. I said, you shouldn't graduate without 3 informational interviews in your final semester. And they usually say, what is that? And so I go into the description of that. But the notion is you should be talking to people who are doing jobs that you find interesting and find out why, what do these jobs entail? How do they get into these jobs? What do they find rewarding about them? Because that's the kind of information that puts somebody in a more proactive, instead of internal locus of control, it's external locus of control activity that looks to see how can I utilize that information to find my own work 9 times out of 10 that are not job announced. But your resume got passed to somebody and you get a call for a job that's relevant to what you were looking for. So there are all kinds of things that go with that. I won't bore you with all that stuff.
So let's thank Mike and Jennifer.